Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. We are back looking at the A to Z of PlayStation 1 Hidden Gems, finding 10 games per letter that you may have overlooked or not heard of at all. Don't forget to go back and check out the other letters in this series, as there are possibly a ton of games in them that you don't know about. The letter D has a decent mix of games that you don't ever hear about, and quite a few that were never released outside of Japan that have now thankfully had a fan translation, and sadly a couple that didn't, but they're still perfectly playable. Anyway, how's about I shut the hell up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games. We'll start with what is probably the most well-known game in the video that is still not talked about all that much, and that is Dragon Valor. This is an action game with light RPG elements, and it's got a suitably convoluted story about dragons and dragon slayers. You start the game by killing a dragon, but then it turns out that there's a baby dragon and you go a little soft. You play as the stupidly named Clovis, which sounds more like a brand of butter to me, and you set off across the land killing monsters, raiding caves and dungeons, and ultimately saving stuff. This is a bit of an action RPG, so all the combat is done in real time, and it's actually pretty good. You have a standard 3 combo slash, as well as a jump attack and some ground attacks. These are all very easy to pull off, and you'll need to use a combination of them to take out the pretty wide variety of enemies that come at you from all angles. The graphics here are okay, the character models aren't massively detailed, but they do the job, and they do help to keep everything running pretty smoothly. There is a little bit of slowdown here and there, but nothing too bad. As you progress, you learn new magic, from the usual array of fireballs to healing, and these come in very handy. In fact, healing during levels is almost all done with magic, as there aren't actually a ton of healing items dropped by enemies. Between the levels, you can also visit a shop, where you can buy healing items and items to restore your magic points. These are all quite expensive, which is a bit annoying, and also the items in the shop appear to be random. You're given a map screen after each stage, so you can choose which path you want to take at certain times, but overall the game is quite linear. However, it is a really fun game that will keep you playing with its solid control, decent combat and varied levels. Definitely one to play. Let's head into the oceans now for Diver's Dream. Now, if you've watched the Hidden Gems letter B video, you'll know that I have a soft spot for these types of games. It's from Konami, and you are a diver and you head off to a lovely little island in order to find some treasure and ultimately a famous sunken ship that no one else has been able to find. You make some friends along the way, and a creepy old guy offers to help you, as well as seemingly try to pimp out his daughter to you, but she's kinda hot, so that's alright. As with most diving games, this is split into 2 sections. Firstly, when you're on land, and here you can choose from the menus where you want to go, so you'll be heading to the shop to buy equipment, going to your mate's house to talk to him to get more story, as well as save your progress, and you can also go to the antiques shop to sell any treasures you find on your dives. This is all pretty easy, but there are some pretty unimpressive static images, and it would have been nice to have a little bit of movement. You can also go to the harbour, which is where you can choose the location of where you want to dive, with the more exotic places opening up as you play. And of course, the diving is really the main part of the game. You start off with just your speedos and some flippers, which is kind of unprepared for a man on a quest to find a sunken ship. So you do some people some favours by helping them find their lost items and collecting antiques along the way. Swimming can be a bit stiff, but it controls okay. You hold the square button to move forward and press X to pick up items when prompted. You can also hold the circle button to swim faster, but this drains more air and for some reason your health, so this is only to be used in emergencies. You've got a pretty generous air meter, and as you collect more and more items from your dives, these can be sold for money to buy more equipment. You can buy better flippers to let you move faster, wetsuits that help you swim better, oxygen tanks to dive for longer and deeper, and even spear guns. And you'll need the spear guns, as there's a lot of underwater bastards that want you dead, including man-eating sharks. I actually really enjoyed going on dives, finding treasure and improving. However, there is a ton of grinding to be done, replaying the same areas over and over, as you don't get that much money for the items you sell, and everything in the shop is really damn expensive. It took me about 5 dives just to buy the cheapest items. However, as you open up new areas and are able to last longer underwater, you can find better things to buy. Also, I found that the further into the stage you are, the better the items seem to be, so I tended to ignore the first few things I see and then just start grabbing things at the end of the caves as I made my way back, as you do only have a limited number of spaces. Now, really that's all there is to the game. You're given a number of objectives for each location you dive at, and having to fight massive sharks was a surprise and one I enjoyed. But it can also be a relaxing game, and I do recommend checking this one out for sure. Dead in the Water from ASC Games is a racing/vehicle combat game that all takes place in the sea. It's sort of a cross between Hydro Thunder and Twisted Metal. You're given a ton of wacky characters to choose from, each of which have their own stats and vehicle of course, as well as the required over-the-top tood from this era of game. So you choose your racer and then select from 2 game modes, race or battle, and then you do just that. Battles are simple, and you're put in an arena with 3 opponents and you have to blast each other to bits. Last one standing wins. The arenas are littered with weapons and boosts that you'll need to use to take out the other competitors. You get rockets, lasers, flamethrowers, as well as shields and invisibility cloaks that you can use for defense. You know, the usual. Your craft also has a machine gun that is very weak, but has unlimited ammo. The stages all have a number of destructible bits to them, which is nice as you can go crashing through obstacles, and there's also ramps dotted around all over the place that you can use to jump into new areas that often have better weapons, or they can even be used to avoid enemies. The enemies here are pretty tough, and it can be hard to hit them. You have to press up on the D-pad to accelerate, which does take a while to get used to, and of course, since you're in the water, you have to contend with waves that make steering tricky and can throw you about all over the place. But the physics are actually pretty good, so once you get used to it, you'll be able to take corners and dodge like a pro. You also have the race mode. This has some of the same arenas as well as its own tracks, and is of course a race. There are checkpoints in the levels, but no timer thankfully, so they're just there to help keep you pointed in the right direction. There's still a ton of weapons on the courses, and you can still kill or be killed. But be careful, as if you are destroyed, then that's it. You don't get any respawns. This actually makes the races way harder, as the courses are often more narrow and linear, with everyone always going in the same direction, so it's hard to avoid being shot. But likewise, it does give you more chances to shoot your opponents. The graphics here are pretty good. There's a fair bit of texture warping, but everything moves at a good pace, and the pop-in isn't too bad, though it can be hard to tell which direction you need to turn until the last minute. The sound and music is alright. It's the typical generic rock and punk soundtrack, though I will say that you'll probably get tired of hearing the characters 2 or 3 phases on repeat every few seconds. But it's still a fun game, and while nowhere near as good as Twisted Metal, it is a fun alternative for an evening or two, especially with some friends. Darkstone from Delphi Software is an action RPG. There is another convoluted story here that dragged on longer than I was willing to watch it for, but the cutscenes are actually pretty good. You get to choose from a bunch of character classes, from barbarians and wizards to thieves and sorceresses. They all play pretty similarly, but have different starting stats. Then you're put out into a pretty ugly looking 3D world where you'll be doing the usual RPG stuff of battling monsters, getting quests from people who have lost their chickens, visiting towns to buy items, leveling up, and of course exploring dungeons. In fact, that is the main focus of the game. While you're exploring the land of Ardil, you come across a tower, but you know, those ones that go underground, not up. And you have to get as far down there as you can before eventually beating the big bad that is living there, who's probably just minding his own business. Now, if you've ever played a Diablo game, it's basically the same as that. Now, I don't know for sure, but it seemed that the levels were all randomly generated each time I played, as I tried a few different characters out, and things never seem to appear in the same place, which is nice and it keeps things fresh. You can also save your character's progress and choose which one you want to use every time you restart the game, and they will keep their stats and levelling up as you go. And the levelling up, while needlessly confusing at first, is actually done in the style that I like, where you're given a bunch of points every time you level up to spend on your different attributes, which are speed, health, strength, and the blue heart, which I'm guessing is magic. This means I can do my usual thing of just pumping everything into strength and health, as I like to just run into battles with massive swords and smash stuff, but you do you. You find loads of items on the way, as well as new weapons and armour to make you stronger and take less damage. You'll need to leave the dungeon every now and then as well, as you can go and buy stuff like better equipment that tends to be in the shops rather than laying around in a damp dungeon. Also, you may have found an item that one of the villagers is looking for. As mentioned, the graphics are actually quite bad, with a low polygon count and very jaggedy edges, but they do the job. The controls are responsive, and the combat, which is basic, is good enough, and I actually found this game to be really addictive. It was fun to see how far in the dungeon I could get, and the levels change up fairly often, so even though you are doing the same thing over and over, it never really got boring. Thankfully, you can choose to start from later stages of the dungeon once you've unlocked them, so you don't have to start from the beginning every time you play, unless you really want the XP. This is a game that at first I thought was actually quite bad, but after about half an hour I was hooked and I wanted to keep playing, so I did. This is one of those games that is ugly, but it plays really well and is well worth checking out. Disruptor is a first-person shooter from Insomniac, the same company that is currently making the amazing Spider-Man games for the PlayStation. And by that I mean the games are amazing, they're not based on the Amazing Spider-Man. You know what I mean. Anyway, Disruptor is one of those games that when I started playing it, I thought, why the hell haven't I played this before? As it's an awesome Doom-style FPS that has awesome 2D sprites as enemies, really smooth gameplay, great control, and some really nice mechanics. The story here is that you're a soldier and you're sent on a bunch of missions. I mean, there is more to it than that, but that's all that really matters. This is all played out in some suitably terrible but awesome FMV cutscenes that are fun to watch for a few minutes. Then you get into the missions, which range from finding the exit to blowing up terminals or fighting bosses or collecting certain items and then making it to the exit. Thankfully, you get a decent selection of weapons to use, from your standard pistol, which is then upgraded to a machine gun, as well as laser guns, shotgun things, rocket launchers, and more. What's cool is that as you progress, you rank up in the army, and you also get new psychic abilities or health improvements. All of these are vital in staying alive. You start with a shock attack that has a relatively short range, but is also really powerful, and one that you'll be constantly using throughout the game. You also get a heal ability, and later even some devastating grenade-like energy bombs. These all use your psychic power, which is indicated in the bottom right of the screen. You actually have another ability called Drain that lets you drain psychic energy from enemies, which you need to collect. This is how you replenish it. It didn't take long for me to realise that you really want to use Drain on pretty much every enemy you see before you kill them, so you always have Psi abilities available, as some levels are pretty short on ammo and some levels don't give you a weapon at all. Graphically, I really like this game. The 2D sprites all look really good. While some of the enemies are a bit lacking in frames of animation, it does mean that the action is always fast and smooth, just how I like it. Everything runs so well, and this is probably the best running FPS game I've seen on the PS1. There isn't really that much I can say about this game that's negative, other than sometimes the levels can be confusing in their layout, but that's what a lot of them were like back in the day. They're more maze-like, relying on you finding switches and keycards to open new areas, though you do get a fairly decent map, so it's never too hard to find where you need to go. This is probably already one of my favourite games for the PS1 now, but I never really hear anyone talk about it. I highly recommend adding it to your collection if you haven't got it. Let's head over to Japan now to see some games that we never got over here. This is Devilman from Bandai. You're treated to an awesome intro with demons all fighting and murder each other in a bloody battle. Then we get to modern times and a bunch of Japanese people say a load of stuff that I don't understand, but I'm sure it's very important. Luckily, most of this was skippable. But I found that I was able to get pretty far here without speaking the language, which is good. And there's also a few guides for the game online that you can follow if you do get stuck. Basically, it's a survival horror game, similar to Resident Evil. You start the game exploring a large house that's falling apart, and it turns out to be filled with monsters that you need to avoid and eventually kill one way or another. The game looks really good, with some great looking characters and enemies, and there's a lot of detail on just about everything. There's also plenty of cutscenes here while you're playing, and I really wish I knew what was going on. The controls are decent. You can run and jump here, unlike most survival horror games. You'll need to leap across large gaps in the floor and can even climb in some places. You do have to be careful though, as you have a stamina bar that will eventually run out if you are sprinting everywhere, and then you're open to be eaten. You can also sneak, which you'll need to do quite often, as enemies can hear your footsteps. This is quite an interesting mechanic, as it also means that you need to watch what surfaces you're walking on, as if you're walking on carpets, it's much quieter than it is on the wooden floorboards. This is a really cool thing to add. There's a lot of times in the game where you have to run and hide from enemies in between solving the usual survival horror style puzzles. You'll find maps and items along the way, and you have a generous amount of space in your inventory, which is nice, so plenty of healing and stamina replenishing items can be carried. It can be a little slow to get going, but this could just be me, as I obviously didn't have a full grasp of what I was meant to be doing, but this is a decent survival horror game that would have been even better if I could speak Japanese. But don't worry if you can't, as it is still pretty accessible. Another one never to come out over here is Deep Freeze, an action game that is kind of like Die Hard. You play as a cop and you can choose from your partner, and you're then unleashed into a massive shopping complex skyscraper to take out some terrorists. The game has a really cool arcade feel to it, with simple controls and a generous lock-on system to help take out those pesky terrorists. What's cool is that all the voices here are in English, but the subtitles are Japanese. So this game is very accessible, and as long as you don't skip all the cutscenes, you'll know what's going on. Sadly, all the menus and messages that come through on your PDA are in text form only, so I have no idea if they were giving hints or what. Thankfully, the game is actually easy enough to figure out. You've got a map of the skyscraper and you can see what rooms you need to enter. So I just ran around entering all the rooms I could, killing terrorists and rescuing hostages, and I made some decent progress. The controls are very good. They are tank controls, but that does work in the game, as it has a generous auto lock-on system, as I've said, so as long as you're facing the general direction of an enemy, you'll lock on and just need to hammer the shoot button. You get a few weapons, like a pistol, shotgun and machine gun, and they all have infinite ammo, which is nice. Of course, you want the shotgun for close range, machine gun for groups of enemies, and the pistol is accurate and decent for taking out 1 or 2 enemies efficiently. You also get some sub-weapons, like grenades. Before you start your mission, you can choose a partner. These all come with their own personalities and weapon loadouts, and actually, they do a decent job of looking after themselves and even having your back. They will actively fight enemies, and thankfully there's no friendly fire, so you don't have to worry about accidentally shooting them in the face. You can give them simple commands too, like asking them to be more or less aggressive, or to wait for you, which can come in handy at various points. Like if there's a ton of enemies and a hostage, you might want to ask them not to shoot, just in case the hostage runs into their line of fire, as the hostages are idiots. The graphics here are good, and all the levels are pre-rendered. Characters are a decent looking model, and everything runs pretty smoothly, and I don't remember getting any slowdown, which was nice. Overall, I had a lot of fun with this game. It's a shame that it isn't 2-player, as it seems perfect for a co-op game, and my biggest complaint is that even with the map, it can be easy to get lost or run around in circles thanks to the fixed camera angles and not knowing where on the screen to exit to get to the next area. Other than that though, this is a really good game that anyone can play thanks to the English voices. Definitely one I would add to the collection. Back to the West now for Danger Girl, a sexy third-person action game that's based on a comic book series that's basically a rip-off of Charlie's Angels. Throughout the course of the game, you take control of 3 sexy spies with massive arsenals, completing missions to take down an evil terrorist organisation. The game is split into 12 pretty large levels, and they all have multiple objectives, which are all varied, and it's actually surprising to see just how much variety there is here. One minute you're in a jungle destroying ammo caches, the next you're in an oil rig rescuing hostages, and then you're breaking into a museum to steal an artifact. And what's even more surprising is that the game actually plays well. Each of the characters controls the same with tank controls, but you can strafe, duck, jump and roll, and you'll need to do all of these, and it is recommended that you do take cover when possible while fighting enemies, as they do put up a decent fight. You've got a good lock-on ability, which makes taking out enemies at close range pretty easy, and you can also go into an aim mode for more precise firing, but you can't move when you're doing this. But it is good for long-ranged attacks, or when you're in cover, and what's even better is that headshots count here, so you can quickly take out enemies and quietly if you need to do this. There's also quick time events, which are actually quite well done and not overused. The game actually warns you when they're coming up, and they're generally nice looking cutscenes, and thankfully if you do fail, you tend to just lose some health rather than dying completely. The downside though is that these bits did get a bit choppy with the frame rate, which meant that the game didn't always register my inputs, which was annoying. The graphics here are surprisingly good, and of course a lot of detail has gone into the pre-rendered cutscenes and making sure the girls are as jiggly as possible, though sadly there's no jiggle physics in-game. Everything does have a lot of detail though, and the levels are massive with not too much pop-in and no fog, which is quite impressive. This does often come at the expense of slowdown though. The large levels are actually one of the downsides to the game though, as checkpoints are few and far between, and if you die, you go back to the start of the level if you haven't found one. This can mean a ton of backtracking, as some of the missions can take up to an hour to beat when you don't know what you're doing, and a few of them have times where you'll run around a corner only to see a hostage who then gets shot in the face and it's mission over, so you've got to be careful. Also, enemies are very good at spotting you before you spot them, and they could be anywhere, above or below you, and they're a pretty good shot. Thankfully, you do have a radar which helps here, and there are health kits all around the levels, so as long as you're a bit cautious, you'll tend to be okay. I actually owned this game for ages after buying it when I first got my PS1, and I have beaten it a couple of times. And while it might look like it's just an excuse to have women with giant knockers bouncing around, this is all kind of played for laughs, and the game here is actually a solid one that is well worth playing. Just remember, it's not an easy game, and amazingly, it's still way better than the Charlie's Angels game we got on the GameCube and PS2.
Deuce, Bow, you guys still listening?
JC, it's Abby. Where are you?
Made famous by
Here is Deathtrap Dungeon, or sometimes called Ian Livingstone's Deathtrap Dungeon. I'm not sure if I'm meant to know who Ian Livingstone is, but I don't, and I don't really care. But he has made a fun game though. The story here is that some evil git has made a dungeon, and if anyone manages to make it to the end, they'll be rewarded with untold riches, but they risk their lives by entering. It's kind of like Saw if Jigsaw accepted volunteers. You can choose from two characters. There's a buff, growly man or a sexy woman. They play fairly similarly, but the bloke is slightly stronger and the woman is slightly faster, but really I found them both fine to play with. You enter the dungeon and have to make your way through a ton of traps, enemies and hazards, and it definitely isn't easy, but it is enjoyable. The game is made by Eidos, who did the original Tomb Raider games, and you can actually really see that here. The controls and level design share a lot of similarities, and even some of the mechanics, like using switches and the platform puzzles here, are familiar, but in a good way. The game looks decent, with a very fantasy style to it. There's a lot of varied enemies, from goblins and orcs to giant spiders, and even dinosaurs and robots, and I think the dinosaur might be a callback to Tomb Raider 2. The combat here is fine if a little clunky. You basically hold down the attack button and then press different directions to do different attacks. It works and is actually handy for killing enemies behind you. You'll also find a ton of weapons in the levels to use, like bombs, throwing knives, magic spells, and even some rudimentary guns. These are selected in a menu that isn't that friendly to use, but as they're useful, you should learn how to use them. You can also block enemy attacks, which does come in very handy. Your character moves pretty decently too, and can jump pretty far, and climb some surfaces. It will take a bit of getting used to, but actually getting around the levels is fairly well done, and they seem to have been made to compensate for the controls, often with wide areas rather than tight corridors. The biggest problem though is the camera, which doesn't do a terrible job of keeping up with the action, but could have been a hell of a lot better, often facing the opposite direction to where you need it. But you have no control over the camera. However, you do have a first-person look view that you can use, so I would do this to line myself up with the jump or whatever I was trying to do, and then most of the time it worked, so it's manageable. The levels here are pretty large actually, and I haven't managed to finish the game. I've got to stage 4 and I've easily taken about 5 hours to get here. Of course, now I know where to go and what to do, I will be able to do it a lot quicker, but the levels are big. And it's a tough game, but I really enjoyed playing it, and I'd quite like to see it get a remake to be honest. It's got a great premise and could easily be made into a really cool co-op game, or one where you're racing to get through the dungeon to get the treasure before your friend. But for now, if you're up for some solo treasure hunting, give this one a try, if you think you're up to the challenge. And finally for today, we're going back to Japan for Dr. Slump, which has now had an English translation. Now, I'm pretty sure this is based on an anime or manga, but I'm almost certain that the character you play as, Arale, or however you say it, has been in Dragon Ball, but as always, I'm too lazy to look it up. Now, what's the game about? Well, you're Arale, a robot girl that a scientist has made, I won't ask why, and you're young and innocent. You spend the first few hours of the game wandering around your town, making friends, going to school and learning things. I actually mean learning things too. As you're a robot, you watch what people do, and this adds new abilities to your arsenal. For example, there's one part where you see two kids have a fight, and because of that, you learn how to punch. Similar things happen that let you learn how to jump, sprint, crouch, and more throughout the game. It's a really cool mechanic. After what feels like forever, the game then switches to a 3D platform game where you travel through time periods and have to fight enemies and collect items. These sections are done really well, and although the camera is a pain every now and then as you have no control over it, exploring and finding all the hidden stuff here is fun. Also, the combat is simple, but it works well, and there's some really cool bosses in here too. Graphically, the game is phenomenal, and quite possibly the best looking game I've seen on the system. The colours are so bright, and everything just looks like a cartoon. The character models are great too, with loads of expression and animation. What's more is that everything is super smooth, and it's really impressive. What's cool is that even though the game takes ages to actually get going, the first part where you're exploring the towns is really fun, and the writing is very funny, and you'll really start to get into the story very early on. There's some strange bits that are very Japanese, like finding porn in the school and having the headmaster explain that it's not his is a little bit creepy, but hey, it's all played for laughs, and yeah, it turns out that it actually wasn't his, and it belongs to your mate. All the characters here are actually quite likeable, and they'll often ask you questions or give you puzzles to complete, which often increases your stats if you get them right. As the story progresses, you get all sorts of crazy stuff happening, like mad doctors and aliens showing up, and you'll go from exploring the town to more platforming stage. It does really feel like you're playing a cartoon, and honestly, does it better than a lot of modern games do. It's very impressive. If you don't speak Japanese, you'll need to emulate this one so it's in English, but either way, I really do highly recommend it, as it's an incredibly impressive game that I'd never even heard of until looking for games for this episode. So there you go, 10 great games to play for the PlayStation starting with the letter D. As always, let me know below what other games there are, as well as any I should check out for upcoming letters. On screen now you can see where you can follow us, so why not do so? We've got loads of cool content for you to enjoy. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.